All right, hi ethicists. Today we're talking about deontology, so today we're talking about deontology, so a rival theory to utilitarianism. Um, I'll be going over some of the material covered in chapter 9 in James Rachel's The Elements of Moral Philosophy. So let's look at some of the principal figures who are covered in this chapter. We get Immanuel Kant, who is a giant in the history of philosophy, really the father of deontology here. And we also, in the Rachel's chapter, run into Elizabeth Anscombe and Peter Geach, more contemporary deontologists. We won't be discussing them so much in the chapter, but again, we're interested not so much in who thought what, but in whether or not we should think it ourselves. So let's jump into the ideas. The first thing I'm going to do is provide what I think to a statement which I think captures deontology. So deontology in a nutshell, which will be a really simple statement of the main points of both chapters 9 and 10. So capturing a lot of deontology in a simple statement. And then through the rest of the lecture, we'll be unpacking the first part of that statement, the material that was covered in chapter 9. So let's get it, deontology in a nutshell. So actions are permissible if and only if they are universalizable and treat all dignified beings with respect. So this I take to be the main moral principle of deontology. There are a couple tests of the moral permissibility or allowability of an action presented in these two chapters. One, the test of universalizability, one, the test of humanity, and both of these are captured in this statement here. So actions are permissible if and only if they're universalizable and treat all dignified beings with respect. Nice to have deontology in a nutshell, but unfortunately there's a lot of new words here that we have to introduce. We have to unpack this, this test of morality. So some questions that come up. How do we know if actions are universalizable? How do we wrap our head around this idea? What does it mean for an action to be universalizable, and what question do we need to ask of it to determine if it's universalizable? Second, which beings have dignity, and why do they have it? What qualities allow beings that have dignity to have it? Or on what is dignity based? Third, what does treating someone with respect entail? So there might be wide-ranging definitions about what respect is and what treating somebody with respect requires and when you wouldn't be treating somebody with respect. We'll be talking about the first of these, the universalizability feature of this test of morality in this lecture. And then we'll be talking about dignity and respect in the lecture about chapter 10. So let's take a step back and ask how we got to this point where we're talking about universalizability. Why are we concerned with universalizability? Why might we think that it would be a good feature, a good making feature of actions? So let's look at that first. So the origins of deontology and the origins of the principle of universalizability are grounded in this idea that when we're considering the morality of an action, we want to make sure that the action, or at least the principle upon which the action is based, the reasoning is consistent and fair. So in this regard, think of some of the objections that we had to utilitarianism in chapter 8. So we thought that, or the book was presenting to us, that maybe utilitarianism is incompatible with an idea of rights, that everybody has rights that shouldn't be taken away. It also might be incompatible with justice. So recall the McCloskey case, where it was alleged that a utilitarian would have to resort to falsely accusing somebody in order to get to the best results. So that seemed, to many readers of the case, that seems to be unfair. The person doesn't deserve to be treated that way. They haven't done anything wrong. If we falsely accuse them just to minimize bad consequences overall, then we've treated somebody unfairly. Also recall that when we looked at backward-looking reasons, and that utilitarians don't seem to respect backward-looking reasons and how we should, that they should play a role in our future actions. So things like obligations, promises we made in the past. Utilitarians would have us sometimes lie if it led to the best overall consequences, sometimes tell the truth if it didn't lead to the best overall consequences. So we might wonder if they are being consistent there. So consistency and fairness, two ways to start attacking utilitarianism. And so deontology is going to start trying to build a morality on these ideas that we value consistency and fairness, and our morality should reflect that. So let's talk about two early attempts to build moral principles around these values of consistency and fairness. So one attempt. You might think, well, what if everyone did that? You might have heard this when you were doing something when you were a kid. Well, what if everyone did that? And if the claim here is if disastrous results would occur if everybody did some particular action, then that particular action is immoral. So if everybody cheated on their exams in medical school, that would lead to disastrous results. People wouldn't get the medical care that they needed because doctors wouldn't have the knowledge that they need to perform the service, right? So on the face of it, this seems like a nice moral principle. But it's actually deficient. It doesn't quite work. And the reason it doesn't quite work, you might think of a way that it's been employed before. So some people have tried to use principles like this to try to say that living a homosexual lifestyle is immoral. So they would say, look, what if everyone did that? And if everyone did that, then until advancements in modern technology, they would say, look, disastrous consequences would be about. There would be no human beings in the world. So because those disastrous consequences would occur if everybody did something, that makes the action itself immoral, even if the action itself, note, doesn't lead to disastrous consequences. So there is an interesting move here to think about the morality of an action not in terms of the actual consequences that come of it, but what consequences would come of it if in a world unlike our own, in a world in which everybody did a particular action. So in this case, lived a homosexual lifestyle. So somebody might think, oh, that's an interesting argument. That shows that homosexuality living a homosexual life is immoral. But of course it doesn't. One reason it doesn't, you might take a moral practice that I don't think anybody is trying to argue against, and show that this argument would show that it too is immoral. So this cuts way too far in showing that things are immoral. So take the practice of being abstinent. So most people who are trying to say that living a homosexual lifestyle is immoral wouldn't also want to say that being abstinent is or abstaining from sex is immoral. But this principle would actually show that would lead to the conclusion that it is. So let's run it through. So if disastrous results would occur, if everyone abstained from sex, then abstaining from sex is immoral. Well, note that the same alleged disastrous consequences that would occur if everyone lived a homosexual lifestyle would also result if everyone abstained from having sex. So this rule would also show that abstinence is immoral. And that seems on the face of it really ridiculous. So this moral principle will tell us that too many things are wrong, things that clearly are not wrong. So let's look at another attempt to build consistency and fairness into a moral principle. That attempt is famous. It's the golden rule. So do unto others as you would like them to do unto you, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, on the face of it, this seems again like a pretty good moral rule for many circumstances. So it explains why in most cases it wouldn't be okay for me to punch somebody in the face, right? Why wouldn't it be okay for me to punch somebody in the face? Because I don't want them to punch me in the face. So far, so good. The reason the golden rule is deficient is because it makes morality depend on people's individual desires. And people have wildly divergent desires. Some people have very strange desires. So you can imagine somebody would prefer, their preferred method of waking up is having somebody run up to them and throw a cold glass of water in their face. So if somebody liked that, if that's how they like to be treated, then the golden rule would license them to treat other people in this way. And that clearly doesn't seem right. Most people don't like to be woken up with a cold glass of water to the face, and yet the golden rule would say that's morally permissible. So the golden rule will also prove to be deficient. So these early attempts at trying to build consistency and fairness into a moral principle that will tell us right from wrong prove not to do that great of a job. So let's talk a little bit more about why our moral principles shouldn't depend on people's individual desires. And then we'll move on to talk about Kant's improvement, or deontologists' improvement on these principles. So we've talked about this a little bit before in chapter, back when we talked about the trolley problems. The word ought is used in two different senses. There's a non-moral sense and a moral sense. So compare these two sentences. If you want to pass this class, you ought to carefully read the chapters in the book. One sense of the word ought. And then the second sense, you ought not lie. So Kant looked at these two different uses of the word ought, and he noted that the first sense of the word ought marks a hypothetical imperative. So note that word if. When does that first statement actually command you? When, in what circumstances does it tell you that you ought to do something? Well, only if you want to pass the class. If you don't have that desire to pass the class, then you're under no obligation to carefully read the chapters in the book. It depends. The force of the ought completely depends on whether you have the relevant desire. But note, in the second sense of the word ought, no desire is used there. So while the first sense marks a hypothetical imperative, the second sense in you ought not lie marks what Kant calls a categorical imperative. And that just means, so imperative, something you have to do, and categorical, in what circumstances do you have to do it? In all circumstances. So you ought not lie when you want not to lie? No, if somebody says you ought not lie, they're saying you ought not lie, regardless what your particular desires are. It's a command of morality. It's a categorical imperative that you ought not lie. At least that's what we mean when we say sentences like that. Kant reasoned. So Kant says the imperatives of morality are categorical. They admit of no exceptions and do not depend on any desire or inclination that any person might have. They're rules that reason gives to us, not that we feel our way to, but that we reason our way to. So he's going to try to build a moral principle that will build in the idea of fairness and consistency, and that our reasoning will allow us to use to determine whether our actions are morally permissible or not. So that brings us to the first formulation of the categorical imperative. Now, Kant, notoriously difficult to read, said that there was but one rule of morality, one categorical imperative, and then very confusingly, he gives 4 different variations of that categorical imperative. We'll just stick to 2 variations of the categorical imperative. And recall, the categorical imperative just means a rule which applies to all circumstances. So the first proposal here, or the first formulation of the categorical imperative is this: act only according to that maxim, by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So this is sometimes called the universality requirement for actions to be permissible, for actions to be acceptable, morally acceptable for you to do. Now, there's some difficult terminology in here that we need to unpack. So first is this use of the word maxim. Maxim for Kant is another word for rule. So we act based on rules of action. Since we're rational beings, we make rules for how we'll act in a variety of circumstances. So a maxim is both what you plan to do and why you're planning to do it. So we have, when we act, generally, we have goals that we're trying to accomplish. And a maxim captures both what we're doing, what we're planning to do, and why we're trying to do it, what goal we're trying to accomplish through our actions. Like, you might think, I'm taking this class. You might have a number of reasons for that, right? So I'm taking this class because I want to accomplish learning more about morality, or I'm taking this class because I want to accomplish getting my degree. So one thing to note about the maxim and the actions we were just talking about, we talked about one action, you taking the class, but 2 different maxims you might have. So even though those 2, the action was the same in both those examples, you could have 2 different maxims because 2 different things you were trying to accomplish. And we'll come back to this later on. This is an important piece of Kant's morality. So maxims all have the form: I will perform action A in circumstance C in order to produce effect E. So I feel like this is getting really abstract. It might be really unclear how you can determine whether or not you can, at the same time as performing the action, want it to be, or will that it would become, a universal law governing all rational beings. So I'll give you the way I test this. So way suggested by Kant, and the way I try to make this a little bit more concrete for myself. So maybe you're familiar with how many movie trailers start. Stereotypically, they start like this.
In a world where cat videos and memes rule the age, one media company will rise above the noise. This is a great big story.
Okay, Red, that's great. Thank you.
Got it?
Yeah, that's great.
Cool.
You can still speak like that now, though.
What do you mean? This is how I always speak.
All right, so stereotypically, movie trailers start with that really deep voice saying, in a world, and then they go on to set up some weird world for the movie that's, supposed to entertain us. So we're going to start with that same question, because one thing to note, recall that when we were evaluating the what if everyone did that question, For Kant, too, when we're evaluating the morality of an action, we're not considering the actual consequences. So deontology is not a kind of consequentialism like utilitarianism was, where you consider the actual consequences of the action to determine if it's morally permissible or not. For Kant, what you have to consider is a world, so in a world where everyone is doing what I'm trying to do, would I be able to accomplish the goal of my action? So in a world where everybody is doing A in circumstance C, would I be able to produce E, the effect that I'm trying to produce in doing A? So let me put that up for us, and then we'll look at a couple actions and see if they pass this universalizability test. So again, in a world in which everyone is doing X, would I be able to accomplish my goal for doing X? So let's look at a couple of examples and run this test on them. So imagine you're in line, it's a really hot day, and you're trying to get some lemonade, but it's a really long line because a lot of other people want lemonade too. You see that a couple people are really engaged in conversation, so in front of you, so you think to yourself, oh man, I could cut in line, and then I could get my lemonade faster, quench my thirst, and stop waiting in this line. It's boring, right? So you ask yourself the universalizability test. So you ask, in a world in which everyone was cutting in line, would I be able to accomplish my goal for cutting in line? In other words, would I be able to get my lemonade faster by cutting in line? And it's quickly obvious that you couldn't accomplish your goal in that world, because what cutting in line relies on is that other people will wait their turn. So in a world in which everybody's cutting in line, then once you cut in line, then people would be cutting in front of you. Nobody would be getting to the front because everybody would be cutting. So this fails the universalizability test. It's not something that we could will to be a universal law governing all rational agents. So it's immoral, it's impermissible according to this test. Let's look at another example. Say you're late to class. You're late to class, and imagine it's not an online class. You're late to getting to a physical class, and there's a ton of traffic. So you think to yourself, you look over and you see an empty carpool lane, right? And you only have yourself in the car. But you ask yourself, or you think to yourself, if I jump over to that carpool lane, I'll be able to get to class faster. I'll be able to get to class on time. So then you want to see if your action is morally permissible. So you ask yourself the in a world question. So you ask, in a world in which everyone is hopping over to the carpool lane, would I be able to get to class faster by hopping over to the carpool lane? And clearly the answer is no. Why couldn't you accomplish your goal in that world? Because everybody would already be over in the carpool lane. So it would you wouldn't be able to accomplish the goal of your action there. So again, this fails the universalizability test. It would not be something that would be morally permissible. Let's look at one other action that fails the universalizability test, and then we'll consider some other cases. So false promising. This is something Kant makes a very big deal about. So false promising and lying, two things which Kant thinks are always immoral, regardless of the circumstances. And let's see how he reasoned that through. So consider a case where you're trying to get a loan from a friend. So say your friend is pretty well off, right? They have a lot of money. You are not well off, but you need money to make rent. So you're considering trying to get a loan from your friend. But imagine furthermore that you've taken a lot of loans from your friend, and they're not willing to give you any more loans unless you can assure them that you'll pay them back. Imagine also that you know that you won't be able to pay them back, that for whatever reason, maybe it's crushing student debt. Sorry to get really real, but maybe it's crushing student debt or a dead-end job, a bad job market, whatever it might be, you're unable to pay them back. So you're wondering, is it morally permissible to ask your friend for this loan, lie to them and tell them you'll be able to pay them back even though you know you won't be able to? So to see if that's permissible, you'd have to run it by this universalizability test. So you'd have to ask yourself, in a world in which everyone is lying to try to get loans, would I be able to get a loan by lying about being able to pay it back? And the answer that Kant came to here is no, you wouldn't. So why does he think you wouldn't be able to accomplish your goal in this world? Well, one of Kant's key insights is that a lot of times immoral action, what we're doing when we're doing something immoral is treating ourselves as if we're an exception to a rule that our success depends on everybody else following. And that's what's going on with this case of false promising. So you're lying in order to get the loan. Well, in a world where everybody did that, what would that world be like? Well, that would be a world where nobody trusted anybody. The whole foundation of trust and promising and promise keeping and believing promises and banking on them being carried through would cease to exist. People, if somebody came and asked you for a loan in that world, promising to be able to pay it back, you wouldn't take their word for it at all, right? You'd say, oh, this is a world where everybody lies. Of course I'm not going to believe you. Of course I'm not going to give you the loan based on what you just told me. So false promising and more broadly, lying in general depends on the success of lying. So what we're trying to do when we're lying is try to convince somebody that we're telling the truth and try to get them to act as if we were telling the truth. And the only way they're going to do that is if in general people tell the truth. So when we're false promising or when we're lying, Kant reasons, we're treating ourselves as if we're an exception to the rule, and our success in lying will depend on everybody else following the rule. So this isn't fair. It's not treating other people fairly. It's not consistent. We're treating ourselves as an exception. So it's morally impermissible to lie. So this universalizability test is, so far, seems pretty good. It tells us why cutting in line is wrong, why abusing the carpool lane is wrong. Those seem relatively uncontroversial. Why false promising or lying is wrong. Generally, we seem to agree that it is morally wrong. Is it always wrong? Do we think it that strongly as Kant did? Maybe not, but most, if asked just flat out, do you think that lying is okay? Most people would say no. So these seem to jive with our intuitions for the most part. But let's consider some, let's evaluate this principle of universalizability. So here we'll consider some good features and some potentially problematic features of this test. So some good features. If the maxim, if your maxim is universalizable, if you ask that in a world question and you find that, like in that world where everybody's doing it, I could still accomplish the goal of my action, then what that tells you is that you're performing an action for reasons which you could will that everybody follow. So reasons which everybody could get behind, right? Not necessarily that they would, but reasons that everybody could recognize as reasons for action, reasons that could apply to everybody, right? That's a good thing. Also a good thing here is that the moral evaluations of actions for Kant and for deontologists and based on this principle of universalizability are not based on the consequences, the actual consequences of the action, but rather they're based on what's motivating the action. So what goal is the person trying to achieve, right? Now, why is that a good thing? Well, one thing Kant is very clear to point out is that the consequences of our actions are sometimes not in our control. So we're trying to accomplish one thing, and we end up doing something we didn't even intend to do. If you've read some Shakespearean plays, a lot of times this is what happens. The protagonist does something. It's in this world where everybody has competing motivations, and then their action gets twisted and turned till what happens based on their action is unrecognizable to the actor. So it would seem unjust to hold people morally responsible for something that was not in their control, and consequences seem frequently out of our control. So that doesn't seem fair. So what is in our control? Well, what we allow to motivate us to act, what we try to do, not necessarily what we accomplish, but what we aim to do, right? So if you're trying to cure cancer, but you accidentally unleash a horrible virus on the world, well, Kant will say, if you were doing everything you could to try to cure cancer, but accidentally had a horrible consequence, then your action was still good. The maxim of your action was still good. It's just unfortunate that it led to bad consequences, but we can't hold you responsible for that because it was out of your control, right? So that seems to be a good feature of the principle of universalizability, a good feature of deontology generally. So what are some problematic features of the principle of universalizability? Why do we have to go over that other formulation of the categorical imperative? One reason we have to go over it is it seems like universalizability is not sufficient for permissibility. In other words, just because an action is universalizable, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay to do that action. Consider the case of the fanatic. So I grew up at times in the suburbs, and I knew people who the thing they cared about most in the world was how their lawn looked. And if their lawn looked good, they're feeling good. If their lawn looked bad, they're not feeling good. And they're pissed off at whoever messed up their lawn. So imagine a character like this, right? All they care about is the condition of their lawn. And imagine they have a mailman who frequently, when delivering the mail, walks on their lawn and messes it up. It's pristine otherwise, but then there are these footprints in their lawn. And they're real crazy about their lawn. So they think, is it morally permissible for me to shoot this person? Shoot this mailman. I know, this is escalating really quickly. Is it morally permissible for me to shoot this mailman to keep my lawn clean, or to keep my lawn looking nice? And so they ask themselves the universalizability question. So they ask themselves, because they're of course concerned with being moral, so they ask themselves, in a world in which everybody is shooting people who step on their lawn, would I be able to keep my lawn nice by shooting this person who's stepping on my lawn? And the answer, interestingly, is yes. It would be even easier to keep your lawn nice if everybody was shooting these habitual lawn steppers. So based on the test of universalizability, this passes. So it would be something that's okay to do, but it seems very clearly that it's not okay to do. So universalizability doesn't seem sufficient for permissibility. Is universalizability even necessary for permissibility? In other words, can you think of an action that's okay to do even though it's not universalizable? I'll leave this open as a question for now. I gave you an example of something that's universalizable, but it's not okay. Now can we think of something that's not universalizable, but is okay? I'll leave you to think about that. So, finally, we get to some quiz questions on this chapter. So, first, what's the primary problem with the golden rule? A, it takes consequences into consideration, and it should not. B, it makes morality depend on a person's desires, and it should not. Or C, it fails to explain why we shouldn't punch other people, and it should explain that. So what's the primary problem with the golden rule? Quiz question number 2. To test if a course of action is universalizable, which of the following questions do you need to ask? A, would this action be permissible anywhere in the Milky Way? B, in a world in which everyone is doing what I'm planning to do, would the action result in good consequences for everyone? Or C, in a world in which everyone is doing what I'm planning to do, would I be able to accomplish the goal of my action? Which of those questions do you have to ask to determine if your course of action, if the maxim on which you're acting is universalizable? And finally, the principle of universalizability fails to provide an adequate solution to which of the following problems? A, the problem of fanatics, B, the problem of false promising, or C, the problem of consistency. Which of these problems remains a problem even if we start judging actions by the principle of universalizability? A, B, or C? All right, thanks for sticking with me through this. Next lecture, we will talk about Kant and respect for persons, which will be chapter 10 in the Rachel's text. I will see you soon.